Good morning, everybody. My name is David Jameson. I'm the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands. It's Tuesday, the 16th of June, and it's 10 a.m. This is the Strategic Police and Crime Board that I hold on a monthly basis. And today we've got, as usual, a very full agenda, plus some questions from members of the public. We have a very important paper to take today on use of force and stop and search. This, of course, is part of regular papers that we receive on this, and it has become particularly poignant at this present time. Today we have also questions from the public, which we'll hear from a little bit later on. If I could just introduce the board members. We have my deputy, Wahid Salim. There's Dr. Kath Hannon, Dr. Sarah Marwick, Brendan Connor, who leads on the use of force issue for me, and Gurinder Singh Yosan, and Tom McNeil, who is also my strategic advisor. And we're delighted, of course, to have with us the Chief Constable, David Thompson, and Assistant Chief Constable, soon to become at the end of the month, the Deputy Chief Constable, Vanessa Jardine. So welcome to you all. If we just deal with some of the niceties of the meeting. Firstly, are there any apologies that we have received? I see that there's no indication of that. The item 2 is the notes of the last meeting. I don't think there's anything that we haven't dealt with that arose from the last meeting that needs to be said here. So I'll move on from that. Now, what we're going to do now is take in item 3 is questions from the public. About 2 weeks ago, I called on members of the public to place their questions in written form to us through our website, and we've had a really quite good response, and quite a few have come in the last hours and days, and I thank everybody for sending those questions in. That's very, very helpful. And what we have done is grouped the questions together because many of them are covering similar themes. So although we may not mention the name, we're only going to use people's first name, not the second name. But what we're going to do is to bunch them together and ask the Chief Constable if he will respond to those questions. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to my Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner, Wahid Salim, who is going to read out the questions on behalf of the members of the public, and then we'll ask the Chief Constable and Vanessa Jardine if they'll respond. So Wahid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Chief Constable, the first question is from Liz, and it's broken into 3 parts. So I'll say all 3 parts to you. So the first question is, what screening measures are in place to detect racism when recruiting trainees? What training is provided to officers to challenge, educate racist thinking and beliefs? And what processes are in place to ensure that officers, especially those of high ranking, represent the ethnic diversity in the UK, specifically the West Midlands? Chief Constable.
So thank you for the questions. I will deal with them in each 3 areas. So first of all, the screening measures that are in place to detect racism when recruiting trainees. So we need to be very clear that there is no one single mechanism that could exist that would identify whether somebody has underlying racist beliefs as part of a selection process. There are a number of things we do as well as the monitoring we carry out in training. So first of all, when people apply to join policing, they are always asked to do on their application checks, and we do a substantial amount of vetting. Part of that checking, first of all, is to see whether anybody has any links or any involvement with extremist groups. There are in-depth counter-terrorism checks carried out on every applicant to ensure that we've got any links or issues to do with extremism or racism that are identified. As part of the selection process, we have a competency and values framework for policing that sets out the high standards that are expected in line with the Code of Ethics, which is very clear on the position the police service takes on discrimination. And part of the selection process is testing people's alignment to those values. We also then have a diverse pool of assessors when we carry out the national selection processes through search to ensure the exercises themselves will look at whether people have biases, but the assessors are there also to objectively judge those. We do, as part of the selection criteria, have a number of questions that relate to understanding of diversity and inclusion as well. And finally, we do a value-based questionnaire that also tests integrity and public service approaches, which again enable people to test whether they have the right values and outlook for policing. So there's quite a lot in place when that work takes place. In line with the vetting arrangements, we do carry out regular reviews of vetting for staff when they're in the organisation as well. And of course, throughout the training of new officers, they are carefully supervised by initially their instructors and their subsequent their tutors. And if we do have issues emerge about inappropriate outlook or views, if those issues can lead us to take action at an early stage in their career, and as people are probably aware, in the early stages of police officers' careers, there is a regulation that enables us to sever our employment of those people fairly early. So we do quite a lot in this space, but also when people are in the organisation, we have a misconduct process that is also there to observe that type of conduct. We then move on to look at the training that's provided, and there is a wide range of training that is provided across a number of areas of policing where diversity and inclusion is featured as part of almost all of those areas. So if you think about the training we do around stop search that we've done for officers, there has been a clear element of that around unconscious bias that's dealt with. When we do the training, as we've done through the uplifted taser and other use of force, diversity issues are addressed. We also particularly address issues around procedural justice and the way to approach de-escalation in those areas, and the similar things are there in self-defense training. But most courses that officers attend will have an element of the consideration of the issues around diversity. There are some specific programs that we provide in the force, particularly aimed at leaders. So all new line managers carry out a dignity at work training on bullying and harassment. We do work around diversity and inclusion as part of all the interventions we do with leaders, which cover 3 particular areas: the championing diversity and inclusion workshops they do, the championing fairness program that we run, and Lead to Achieve and Lead to Inspire, which are specific programs aimed at junior leaders in the organisation, do have specific elements of training. So that covers some of the areas. I'd also add that through the fairness in policing work the force did as part of its diversity inclusion plan, we carried out a number of assessments to test whether parts of the organisation in their processes, systems and approach adopted principles of organisational justice and fairness, which we would see as being key issues to eliminate discrimination in the workplace and also reduce the impact of discrimination in our service as far as we possibly could do. And I think that work is also a hallmark of the work the force has done over a number of years as well. I would also say our staff associations are also heavily involved in recruitment, selection, and some of the work we do around training for parts of the organisation to ensure we reduce the risk of discrimination and bias. Finally, what processes are in place to ensure that the force represents the communities it serves, and particularly at the higher ranking levels of the force? That remains a challenging area. We are starting to attract, I think, a level of applicants from the population that more closely reflects the communities that we serve in the West Midlands. There is a much higher proportion of people from minority communities stepping forward, and also notably from gender, more female applicants for the police service, which is very good and positive. We still remain, I think, in a challenging phase as we adjust to new education qualification requirements for the police service to make sure actually we're trying to support communities who want to apply, who may not at this stage have, some applicants may not have the right grades or qualifications to meet the new education requirement standards, and we need to do more work around that area. We also look to stimulate recruits from the work we do around our programmes with cadets, and it's worth remembering the cadets are the most diverse group of West Midlands Police. So we are very focused in terms of that, and we are seeing an increasing number of minority recruits applying. Some of the recruits that are applying though, and I think we'll talk later about my desire to see more Black British people apply, some groups still, we do not attract enough people to apply. Once people are inside the force, and about 11% of the force is from minority communities, actually what we need to do is that we retain people, which I think we are doing well on, that they can fulfil their careers and talents by progression, and that also while they're in the organisation when things don't go right, that our processes for dealing with conduct issues are managed fairly. So there are some positive things in that space. We've done a lot of work around the talent management in the force already, and we're going to be doing more this year. We're trialing a bespoke BME program for those who want to enter senior selection processes for Chief Inspector and Super. And we've run Aspire for BME staff for a while now, which is a program of personal development to bring forward talent from underrepresented groups. And we've had 120 staff on the force attend that program, which is incredibly positive. A number of our senior leaders are training, coaching and mentoring pool to support BME talent, and we run specific attention on this to the fast track programs. We've been trying to attract more and more BME staff through the work Chief Superintendent Mike O'Hara does to apply for national fast track programs. I think we've seen some very good progress on that, and actually good progress against other forces in the country. We still, though, have a smaller senior leader pool from BME communities, particularly in the superintendent ranks. In part, that's because we've seen some people retire and we've not brought forward people, although we have a better number of chief inspectors who are BME than we've had for some time. But actually, we've had some retirements and we've also had successes. So 2 of our BAME chief superintendents are both currently now chief officers, one who's gone to London and one who's temporarily acting in the force. And that's meant for a period we've had less chief superintendents who are BME. We are looking very hard as to what we can do to fast track people through those ranks, because the lack of diversity in terms of race is particularly marked still, I think, at senior levels in the force. We'd like to emulate the success we've had with senior female leadership, but we're still not there at the moment. And I would say this remains one of the areas that we have got to do more work as a force, and the police service has got to do nationally. So hopefully that addresses most of the issues in the first question.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I will move on to the next question. The next question is again from Liz, and the question is, how does the Chief Constable ensure that police officers are treated fairly and do not face discrimination from other officers based on their race, sexual orientation, or any other characteristics?
So I think we should be very pleased that the force has got one of the highest levels of Black and ethnic minority staff of any police force in the country, but also it identifies how far we've got to go. So with 11% of our staff at that level, that's some way behind the communities we serve at the moment. And so while we have high numbers, we've got some way to go. And the distribution of staff across roles in the organisation also can vary slightly. There are areas with higher levels of BAME staff in some parts of the force than others. And the work we're trying to do through our HR is to make sure actually staff have the ability to access, we take positive action to ensure people can get to all parts of the force where their career wants to take them. In terms of the treatment, we've done an awful lot of work around the promotion processes, first of all, to make sure we eliminate bias, and that has seen improvements in the progression of both women, LGBT staff, but also underrepresented BAME staff as well. So we work very hard on those processes to make sure they are free from bias. And a good example really in the force is that anybody who is eligible for promotion can apply. They don't need the line manager's support, because what we don't want to do is introduce barriers that could potentially be in place that may be unfair or exhibit bias. So we've tried to make those processes objective. It's similar with the positive action programs we run with recruitment into departments. Again, those are substantially supported by our staff networks, and we work very hard. We can't do positive action across all elements of the force simultaneously, but we've tried to target the areas to ensure people can access them. Then in terms of treatment, so we need to be very clear that the force's misconduct processes show a disproportionality to underrepresented groups, particularly Black and ethnic minority staff. That's a subject of considerable concern from our staff associations in West Midlands Police. It's a concern to us. It's also a pattern nationally, and it's echoed in things such as the Morris report that we've done in the past that says there can be a tendency on occasions in organisations when issues and complaints arrive around minority staff that they are escalated to a higher level, or issues are not dealt with proportionally. And so we do a considerable amount of work to police that tightly in the force. There is a triage group that looks at any grievances or issues to see whether they need to be dealt with through HR processes or whether they are actually serious gross misconduct. We take a very robust approach in terms of discriminatory behaviour in the force. I think aspects of that are continue to be newsworthy around the action we will take around people who behave in a discriminatory way in West Midlands Police. And we work very hard with staff networks to improve that and deal with where challenges arise. The simple reality is the force still continues to be an organisation where a disproportionate number of people in the organisation are white men. That is the disproportionate number of people that are in the organisation. It can influence the force's outlook, and so we work closely with staff association and others to improve that position. And it's why recruiting an ever more reflective police force is an important part of ensuring a sustained approach to eliminating any level of bias within the force.
Thank you, Chief Constable. I'll move on to the next question. The next question is from Claire, and it's how do police respond to victims who are black males who have reported a crime? Is their experience different to the victims who are white? And what assurances can the Chief Constable give on this?
So we are here to police all communities fairly, and we want to be seen as policing all communities fairly. And I think that isn't always the way policing can be seen, because I think of many of the issues that have impacted on our history in relationship with the community. When we look at the customer satisfaction data the force has, actually what that does indicate is there's very little variance in the feedback received from the public over the standard of service they receive. It's generally very consistent across all ethnicities. I would also say that, we know from the Lamy review and other areas that young black men are disproportionately impacted on the criminal justice system. And that's not just as offenders, that's also as victims. And so a considerable level of the work the force does is with young black men as victims of crime. I'm very satisfied we work very hard to ensure we provide the right service, the right support, and we investigate those issues as effectively as we do in other areas. And I think you'll know many of those cases have been quite high profile, particularly some of the cases where young black men have been the victims of violence. And I think I am very proud of the effort the force puts into that. However, I do accept that there continues to be, I think, concerns. There will continue to be historical outlooks that reflects that people sometimes think our service may not be fair from some communities. I think I'd also say, if I'm honest, more and more of the force is delivering services online. And so actually it's less apparent to people, I think, in terms of the interaction with the force, what is the background of the people we deal with. It's not quite as apparent, I think, through more and more online services we deliver. So I think the public could be confident that we work very hard to provide a fair service. I think the public would be realistic in accepting we don't always get that right for all communities. I accept that the public will still have some concerns about whether treatment is fair from some communities, and we work hard to overcome that. But I think the public would also look at some of the most high-profile cases that have involved diverse communities, or particularly of late, recent cases involving terrorist right-wing organisations, and will be confident that the force works incredibly hard to protect everybody.
Thank you, Constable. We'll move on to the next question, and is from Anonymous. And the question is, as a retired officer, I want to know what the police are doing to protect our great statues, including that of Sir Robert Peel in Birmingham. Will officers use force to protect them or cower away like in Bristol and London?
So I think we need to be very clear that what has been interesting over the last few weeks has been quite an interesting debate that has taken place in society about actually historical figures we celebrate and whether or not that is entirely from the perspective of all communities. That's a mature conversation about history. It's right to be conducted with academic rigour and accuracy, and it's also entirely appropriate it's conducted in a democratic way. Actually, what is not acceptable is tearing down and damaging statues. There are issues of criminal damage, and they are issues the force would pursue and deal with. And I know there's been a huge amount of interest in terms of what has happened at Bristol. I certainly couldn't comment directly on that because we're not involved in the policing of it. But what I do say is on occasions, police has been trying to strike the balance between managing public order, not aggravating public disorder, and looking what's the best way to capture evidence during incidents of disorder. And that doesn't always involve direct arrest at the time. And that is not unusual in the way we have managed many other aspects of disorder across the country. Specifically, the statue of Robert Peel, it is important to reflect that Peel has attracted some level of attention, but there are two Sir Robert Peels. And I think this is the reason why it's important there is some scrutiny over our history, because much of the attention around slavery is related to actually the Peel who doesn't have statues. His son is the one who is the founder of policing. And I don't think actually the attention on Peel has entirely been thought through on occasions, because it's the wrong Peel that many people are referring to. But in general, there are other statues across the region that will be debate around, but certainly from our perspective, any attempt to damage them are matters of criminal damage, and our intention will be to take action against anybody who did that.
Thanks, Chief Constable. We'll move on to the next question, and that it is from Terry, and the question is, what these young people need, as we had back in the day, was something to wake them up to reality, something to teach them respect. Can you not get these young people signed up as special constables or community litter pickers and graffiti cleaners? I fear we're heading into a lawless state where London police run for their lives away from these mobs.
So I suppose I would say this really, that we ought to focus, and I will say this in a moment, on the positive things that we have seen young people saying over the last few weeks in the demonstrations across the country. The criminality has been a small minority part of what's taken place, and it's been particularly focused, I think, on the capital. We know the demonstration we've seen in the West Midlands have been peaceful, and actually the points that young people have been making have been made very articulately. Some of those points relate to policing. They much more broadly relate to broader issues of equality in society. And I think the quality and standard of debate that have been put forward by many young people has been, in my view, very impressive during this time. And we shouldn't lose perspective by looking at the small number of criminals who've engaged in disorderly behaviour in London. I think in terms of young people, the challenge that we recognise in policing is that every generation has a slightly different view on the merits of the younger generation, and we go through that cycle. And it's very important we understand that generations are different in how they approach and deal with things. But from a policing perspective, the contribution of young people is enormous at the moment. We have gone back to police cadets, which I think has been a very good decision. We've seen some incredible contribution from those young people. In a voluntary capacity, we see young people in street watches, very high profile ones in West Bromwich, where young people from the local sixth form college patrol with the police and have been very successful in reducing crime by young people. And the work we do with youth commissioners, the involvement in Stop Search Scrutiny, young people are playing a very positive part in society and community. So my sense is actually young people have a lot of respect for issues. I think they've been very articulate. Actually, we have seen very little in the way of actually serious disorder through these protests, and certainly nothing in the West Midlands. So, but I'm happy we've got good ways the force works positively with young people and assist them to make a contribution to communities.
Thanks, Chief Constable. The penultimate question is from Marco, and it's if a uniformed officer takes the knee in this political environment, which some have, are they in breach of their oath?
So this has been a topic that has been debated, I know, quite widely, and it's very important to say police officers take an oath around impartiality. However, the current protests are about racism, and it is not possible for the police service to be impartial on racism, because actually we are there to uphold the law and protect people, and I'm afraid racism is not an issue that the force can be impartial around. With regard to the issue of taking the knee, that has evolved, I think, as a symbol. I think that many people view it as political. Many people now, I think, regard this as a widespread statement of demonstrating a commitment to anti-racism. The position we've taken in West Midlands Police is this: there are some circumstances where it might not be the most sensible thing to do when we're dealing with large crowds and groups, because actually in that scenario, it may be incredibly challenging to discharge our job and do that. There are other circumstances where it will be entirely the right thing that captures the sentiment of crowds and groups. And also our staff feel very differently about this. We have many staff from Black and minority communities who are would also say they're directly affected and managed by this. So the force has also given officers and staff individual choice as to whether they feel that is an appropriate thing or not to do. I don't think if an officer does this, they, in the circumstances we've seen, breach their oath at all. We can never be impartial on racism, but actually we've taken a view that people will make individual judgments unless there is a broader safety issue that suggests that wouldn't be appropriate.
Thank you, Chief Constable. And the final question is from Kevin, and it's, why have you effectively cancelled COVID-19 restrictions by allowing people to meet in groups of more than 2,000 with no fines being issued?
So there's a real difficult balance here that the police has found themselves in, and I think I've spoke about this considerably. The level of restraints under social distancing the government asked the public to carry out were always really dependent on the public's desire to do that, and policing was always there to police around the margins. I think the challenge that we are trying to balance with the demonstrations we're seeing is we are trying to encourage social distancing. We would want to people not to consider demonstrating at this time, as many police officers said around the country. But actually, when we have large numbers who decide to come together, it becomes, I think, a bigger risk to the public by trying to break up demonstrations of that size and scale. And we are trying to balance, I think, people's freedom of expression about an issue they feel very strongly around, coupled with the health emergency. So I think we have not cancelled COVID legislation. We have tried to ensure people follow public health advice safely. The police are not here to enforce 2-metre distances. We do have some powers on social gatherings, but we're trying to balance the issue between the broader risk to public safety and the freedom of expression, coupled with actually the practicalities of trying to enforce it with that number of people. And I think the decisions that the force and policing have made nationally have been the right ones in this circumstance, because it would be, in my view, potentially more dangerous to the public good to have attempted at a large scale to break these gatherings up. And I think if you wanted a textbook example of why that was a bad idea, then I would say some of the demonstrations in the States are a very good example of what happens when you try to do that.
Thank you, Constable. That's all the questions from members of the public, and thank you for answering those fully. I'll hand over back to the Police and Crime Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Wahid, and thank you, Chief Constable. There were a number of other questions. I think we've covered the general feel for most of those questions, but what we'll attempt to do as well, some of the questions did come in quite late over the weekend and yesterday. So what we'll try and do is cover some of those questions within the context of the discussion on item 5. Can I also just say, for our next meeting in a month's time, if people have further questions, please place those questions on our website. We will have a space available on the website for you to do so in the not too distant future. Item 4 on the agenda is usually questions from members of the board. We have not taken any questions of the member of the board this time because we wanted those questions to come directly from the public. However, there will be questions obviously from the board members in the next 2 items on the agenda. So we come now to item 5A or 5 on the agenda, which is stop and search and use of force, which is going to be presented by Assistant Chief Constable Vanessa Jardine. Going to say, as a preface to this, that force is necessary for police officers to use on occasion. It is part of keeping us safe. So let's be very clear about that. It can take the form of physical restraint. That's to stop somebody harming themselves or harming others or harming the police officer. It could require the use of a baton. It could be stop and search, which is a type of use of force, or it could be taser. And in very extreme and very rare cases, it's the use of a firearm. And I do stress that is very, very rare in this country and certainly within the West Midlands. All of these practices are very invasive against the individual who is on the receipt of them, but they are essential. But what we have to make sure of is that they're used proportionately, and they must be used properly, and there must be very close scrutiny at all sorts of levels, at the level of more senior officers, at the level of my office and the role I take in scrutinising the use of the use of force, but also by the wider public, because by doing that we can then eliminate any misuse or disproportionate proportionate use of that force. Now, I think, although Vanessa Jardine is going to present the report, I think Chief Constable, you wanted to make a comment before that. So, Chief Constable, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. I kind of want to make this comment, I think, in the context that we are bringing this paper forward, because I think it is the context that's driven some of our conversations. So the last few weeks have been extraordinary ones, and I want to preface the papers we're discussing today on disproportionality in that context. So the death of George Floyd's unleashed a moment of great emotion that has swept the globe and created a moment of huge turmoil. It's come as we're moving from a health emergency into what could easily become an economic tragedy. And like many people in this country, I've been on a journey ranging from professional analysis of what's been happening, anger, deep distress, and at the same time, moments of considerable pride about policing. So I feel as a citizen of the country, this city, and as the Chief Constable, I ought to speak now around my view on the context that we're in. And I do this to help us find a way through the coming months, which I think could be very challenging. So I have seen people in this weekend vandalise the statue of Winston Churchill and our cenotaph. I've seen over these last few weeks people purporting to defend these symbols raise Nazi salutes. I've seen decent police officers attacked and the memorial to PC Keith Palmer desecrated. And these have been disgraceful scenes. However, these are not what has made the last few weeks stand out, as they are the acts of a mindless criminal minority. What has stood out are the voices of Black people, often young, who've made powerful points about their lived experience of discrimination, about their perspective on our history and their desire to see change. In huge demonstrations across the country that have been overwhelmingly peaceful. In my time in policing, I felt a captive of our history as a service with Black people. The emotion I encountered as a new officer in Manchester from young Black men, and the desperate attempts to fix the cycle of gun crime in Moss Side with such little trust at times from that community. And today, I'm a Chief Constable in a region where far too many young Black men are disproportionately affected by crime. At times, I have not always understood the anger towards the uniform I wear with such huge pride and the police service I believe to be the best in the world. But more than ever this last week, I do. We, the police, swear an oath to police all our communities. Our country is one of, if not the most tolerant in the world, and our flag is a destination of hope. Yet we are not an equal society, and Black people and other people of colour have, we know, poorer life chances. In this context, policing is judged on its ability to police this unequal society fairly. This is a tough ask, but it's one we sign up to. But our own history of policing is also marked out by discrimination, and I want to acknowledge that. The treatment of new migrant communities in the 1950s, the sus laws, the riots of the 1980s, the death of Steve Lawrence, and many of those issues have played out here also in the West Midlands. Particularly, I think if we look back on our history, the scandals of the Serious Crime Squad that had clear issues about race. So I want to start off our discussions by apologising to Black communities for the things West Midlands Police has got wrong over the years that we've policed them. History has created for some a narrative that we're not to be trusted, and I deeply regret that. And the badge that stands out for many as something of safety on occasion stands out for others as something else and what's something to be feared. It's not just about the past. I recognise that today we're not a service free from bias, discrimination, or on occasions, even racism. We reflect this imperfect society. And I still know, sadly, many Black parents fear for their children from gangs, but also how they may be treated from the police. And in the force, the people of colour in West Midlands Police have served with great pride and have changed policing, but they found this last week also to be traumatic. And we need to listen to all these voices as I and we, the police service in the West Midlands, have more to do. I also make these points because I believe Black community also has a choice, and I say this to other minority communities. So we want Black women and men to join this service. If you want something different, you need to step forward. I don't want history to trap us. And the reason I make these statements is I want your grandparents, your mums, dads, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands and wives to want you to be part of policing as much as I do. A great deal has changed about policing, and the pictures from America are categorically not the police service in this country. I am very proud to lead the courageous men and women in this force who are determined to protect all communities. The force has recently brought the racists from National Action who seek a race war against black people to justice, and we try every day to prevent the violence that hurts our young people. The staff in the force are selfless and they put themselves in harm's way. They are people with good hearts who make a difference every day in society. And it is a service that has made much progress on race and diversity, and one that is never impartial when it comes to racism. So Vanessa will shortly talk about the steps we want to take on policing now to ensure our service is fairer around stop, search and use of force, because they're important issues. They're also complex. We have improved, but as we will see, there is more that we must do. And it will form part of work we do over the next few weeks and months to set out the additional action we intend to take on these issues of race in our police service. I don't believe the protests, however, have been solely about policing. Indeed, I think it's been a much wider debate in the UK. Unlike America, I think the demonstrations have not been about police reform. It's been about creating a much fairer society. And this requires all of us to work to eliminate racism and discrimination. And it's about real change, not just symbolic gestures. And I hope those who lead this city, our country, and across our region reflect on how we can do more as we move forward. So, Commissioner, I was keen we set the context before we jumped into the specifics in this case, because I think the force is absolutely responding to what we've seen and reflects the requirement to do even more than we have done to ensure we deliver a fair and equal police service and promote the best we can to create a fair and equal society. I'm going to hand over to Vanessa to then just talk through the specifics on the paper, and then we will answer questions.
Yeah. Just before Vanessa comes in, could I thank you very much, Chief Constable, for your statement, and I'm sure that those listening will have heard those heartfelt and important words from you as well. And I hope that your remarks will go some way to show that policing is now dealing with some of the issues to do with rebuilding the public trust. Also, you referred to the grotesque irony that we saw this week of a young male with a large swastika tattooed on him, purporting to protect a statue of Winston Churchill, a man who led this country against the very Nazism that man seemed to be promoting. I think in my lifetime, I've seen a number of events that have scarred communities and have sometimes rocked people's confidence in the police. And Hillsborough and the Orgreave, just two of the things in the miners' strike that I recall. But many more things have happened now that have scarred the relationship between ethnic minority communities and the police, and particularly with our black communities. The British policing is a force for good, and it is envied throughout the world. But it doesn't get everything right, and it doesn't get it right all the time. And throughout my lifetime, despite the Scarman report, Macpherson, and more recently the Lammy review, the pain continues. And I hope that the latest commission that the Prime Minister announced yesterday, in addition to that, he actually enacts some of the things from the previous reports. Although I don't oppose a further report.
I think we are losing.
But we need to look at the things that really are with those who want to see policing that has the confidence of everyone. I stand with those who want to see an end to inequality, lack of opportunity, structural prejudice, poor social mobility that blight our country. Disproportionate action by the police is part of those wider issues, and that is where I totally agree with you, Chief Constable, in your analysis of that. Stop and search, as we will hear from the report, and the use of force is still disproportionate, particularly towards BAME people and particularly towards the black community. It's not acceptable and it needs to change. Public scrutiny led by my office has improved those rates well in comparison to some of the national averages. But comparing well doesn't mean to say we're doing our best and we're properly reflecting what our community need. We've rolled out things like body-worn cameras to frontline officers, and they are used in the overwhelming majority of cases and automatically for taser use. Nevertheless, the rates of body-worn camera usage needs to increase even further to build that confidence. By shining a light on these issues and being honest with the public, I'm hoping we can help rebuild that trust. There is a huge amount to do. So last week, as again you referred to, Chief Constable, I announced that over the next 3 years, I want to ensure that West Midlands Police recruit 1,000 or more police officers from our Black and minority ethnic communities to make the force look more like the community it serves. For those new recruits and for the wider public to have confidence in the force, we're trying to build what we need is a meaningful process on the disproportionate rates of stop and searches and use of force. And I hope this is an honest and open debate in public, and what we do next and the action we take is what is really important. So, Assistant Chief Constable, can I hand over to you? Then we will take some questions from the board. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning to the panel as well. So clearly you've had our paper, and I just want to pick out a few of the key points from that paper now, and then get into more of the discussion around it. But I wanted to reiterate how seriously we take our powers and how analysis of the use of stop search and use of force is an absolute priority for us. And the reason that is because we are aware of the impact that such powers can have on local communities and how that directly impacts upon the public's trust and confidence in us. And the current public concerns, as the Chief Constable has mentioned, over racism following the tragic death of George Floyd has brought this into even more sharper focus for us here. And I want to point out that this paper focuses specifically where the powers that we use are disproportionately used on Black and Asian populations. And the reason for this is because how the use of force and stop and search is used on minority communities directly impacts upon our police legitimacy. And the objective in using these powers is always to ensure that such intrusive powers are used legally, fairly, and no more than is absolutely necessary. And if we identify that our power is being disproportionately used against one group of people, we must examine that to ensure that it's not being exercised through bias or discrimination. And that's really important because we aim to assess how fairly we use a power, but we do not police in an equal society. And we are more likely to use our powers in areas where crime is high. And these areas are the areas that also suffer from a number of other inequalities, such as higher unemployment, lower levels of household incomes, and they have a higher concentration of our BAME communities and young people. And policing does not cause these factors, but actually the result of policing can directly affect them. So I want to be clear today to you on the oversight that we have in this area and the scrutiny and governance that we do have in place. And we've looked very closely at some of the data that we have. And we know that in relation to disproportionality, if we break it down to our top 5 geographical locations for the force, for our serious violence and robbery, which is where we exercise most of our powers, then very often our disproportionality does fall. And that's in relation to our use of stop and search. And we also see some disproportionality in relation to age and gender, with a larger proportion of our younger community being subjected to stop and search, and also overwhelmingly that relates to male members of the community. Now, our use of force shows numerous examples of where we record from sort of handcuffing, and you mentioned this, Commissioner, right the way through to the discharge of taser and firearms at the other end. And data here does show that the force is disproportionate against the Black community rather than the wider BAME community. And we really need to understand and carry out further work and assessment in relation to that. We have a number of different processes for scrutiny and governance, and you mentioned yourself how we work with your office to hold that force to account. And we have independent stop search scrutiny panels with each neighbourhood, and they are chaired independently, and they cover a wide number of examples, and the members of the public hold us to account. I would like to say here that we would welcome younger members of our community joining those panels, and they can do that through contacting their local neighbourhood office or contacting us directly. And I really would genuinely welcome that because we want it to be open and transparent, but we want to get that scrutiny, particularly from our younger members of the community, because we know that we impact upon them, and they tell us that, and we really want to draw on that in a greater way. We do use body-worn video to help with that scrutiny, and we have mandated the use of body-worn video in a number of areas for all stop searches, use of force where it's practicable to do so, every time we use a spit hood, with all uses of taser, and that is easier for us to scrutinise because body-worn video automatically activates when a taser is taken out of its holster. And and all instances of domestic abuse, again, where it's practicable to do so. So what we need to do as an organisation is really examine this data and really understand it. But we do recognise and we do accept that there is further work that we need to do to understand that disproportionality. And not only do we need to examine it ourselves, but I think we need to look and seek some academic support to help us with that. But most importantly, we need the community to work with us to help inform and understand our work, but to guide us and help us, because that's the way that we will improve the confidence of the community, which is ultimately what we are seeking to do. That was all I wanted to say on the paper, because I didn't want to go through it in detail, because I know that members of the panel have had an opportunity to read it, but myself and the Chief Constable now are more than happy to accept any questions from the panel.
Thank you very much indeed, Vanessa, and thank you for keeping it very succinct, because that does give us an opportunity now for more discussion. Firstly, then, I want to bring in Deputy Wahid Salim, who's going to begin the questions. Wahid.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We did have some late questions in from Miss Macaroon, who works with young people, but unfortunately we weren't able to put those into the public questions. So we will share those with the Chief Constable. I'm going to just summarise the three main points that have come out of these questions. One is around the accountability of police officers when they are using it, when they use force. Excuse me. The secondly is if a police officer is found guilty of inappropriate use of force, are they subjected to criminal investigations and charged for assault or any other crimes? The third point is around the IOPC investigations and the West Midlands Police's response to IOPC. Especially, I think they made specific reference to Anthony Granger and the GMP issue about offering evidence in relation to those charges. Can you just confirm how West Midlands Police engages with the IOPC investigations? And the last point is, two quick other points. One is around victims. So those public who are subjected to use of force, what support are they given as victims of inappropriate use of force? And the last bit was, there's a lot of young people and others were very confident about the way the policing was done for BLM protests, and they congratulate the police for the way that they did that. And I obviously observed some of those as well, which is really good. But the asking is, can you give some assurance that that kind of interaction, and that is seen as was confidence with the communities, can you give them some confidence that that will continue in other places as well, especially for BAME communities?
Do you want to start off? We'll probably do. There's quite a lot there, so we'll probably have a bit of a double act.
Yeah, sure. So in relation to the use of force, where it is seen as being excessive, then absolutely, you know, officers will be investigated in relation to that, and we have a very, very close relationship with the IOPC to understand what they are investigating and ensure that we appropriately refer into the IOPC. And we're always very keen to learn from those examples. I mean, I was speaking just last week to the IOPC around that matter. So I'd like to reassure members of the public that, you know, we do take that very seriously. And we do, and one of the reasons that we monitor the use of force is that, so we have that audit process, and then we can be accountable, and the individual officers are accountable. You know, the use of force should always be the minimum amount of force used that is necessary in the circumstances, and clearly that will change dependent on the circumstances, but we are very alive to the impact that using force on members of the public has, and we take that very seriously.
I think the bits I'd add to it, and I think this is the period where we need to spend time emphasising what's different than what people see in America. So when we look at the spread of use of force, as we've talked about, the majority of this is police officers restraining or using handcuffs. The high end stuff's very rarely used in relative terms against people. I think we also need to recognise that actually, reasonable force is a very strong part of everything we do. If you look at the recent taser training, lots of the training is about not trying to avoid using it, and I'll come back to that. But I think the other difference is the IOPC exists. So, you know, there is a criteria of things that must be mandatory referred. Excessive uses of force in the circumstances we're talking about would be one of those areas to refer. The IOPCC investigates those serious cases always independently. There is an outcome. People have seen recently, one of our custody sergeants was convicted of an assault as a result of restraint in custody and was sacked subsequently. So those cases do result in sanction. Equally, it's fair to say the other advantage the IOPC brings is that sometimes cases can look problematic to the community, but upon full investigation are not. And you probably have seen recently a video circulating on social media of officers detaining a man in Sandwell that attracted a lot of community concern. That matter's been investigated, and actually when all the video's been seen, the officers have been shown to have used reasonable force. So we need to trust the IOPC as a service and as a community as we do these things. The issue that the question may be referring to is officers not choosing to give evidence. And I think this is just an important point to look at. So officers, if they are under criminal investigation because they may have used excessive force, have the same rights of a criminal suspect. And in some cases, they will independently with their legal advisors take a choice as to what they choose to discuss and when they do. That's not something I direct or control over. It's actually the legal basis we operate on any criminal suspect in the country. And I think we have to recognise when criminal investigations are in place that we clearly expect to see people have the same rights and issues. But I think the IOPC has been pretty effective at investigating cases in this area. I guess the final thing I'd say around it, though, is I am satisfied that actually most of the force uses will be lawful. The challenge, I think, for ourselves is whether or not we can spend more time analysing it to see whether more things we can do to make it avoidable. And I think this is a kind of key issue that while we try and use the minimal force, actually with the body cams and other areas, just like we're doing on SOC search, do we have more ability to debrief these scenarios to begin to ask the question, could we have done something different? That's more tricky in use of force because if officers have been found to use force excessively, they have committed a criminal offence. It's very different than carrying out an unlawful search. But actually, we do need to create a culture of learning to try and promote the even further minimal use of force. So the answer isn't always around criminal investigation, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Vanessa and Julian. Thank you, Wahid. Brendan, can I bring you in next?
Thank you, Commissioner. I read the paper in the early part of last week, and I have a sympathy for the approach that it's based upon looking at the granularity of data at a particular geography and trying to look at disproportionality in that context. But I had some concerns, which I've expressed to the Commissioner in an email that has sort of, I think, about 20 questions that I think need to be answered from this paper. But I don't intend to ask all of those questions because I think that the issue that concerns me is actually a wider one. And it really is this, that if it's my community that is subject to most of the stop and search, if it's my community that is subject mostly to the use of force, if it's my community that has the largest number of taser operations or taser events, and if it's my community that has most firearms operations directed towards it, then the consequence of that in terms of the cumulative impact is quite stark and probably explains some of the attitudes that people express towards policing. So my question to the Chief Constable and to ACC Jardine is that given that that's the backdrop of the cumulative effect of all of this, we do need to have a much more open process of asking questions about each of the stages of this particular holding to account process. So from my point of view, I would ask that we look at these areas jointly in order to ensure that we ask all of the questions that need to be asked. So for instance, just one of them that struck me as being odd was the use of body-worn video. The levels of non-compliance, both in force and search instances, is much higher in a force where supposedly the use of body-worn video is mandated. So those things are something which I think needs to be reviewed. So I would ask the Chief and ACC Jardine whether the force is prepared to jointly look at all of these areas in order to produce a joint report that we can then disseminate to the public as a comprehensive view as to disproportionality as it is felt by the communities that suffer it most.
So I'll probably pick that one up and Vanessa may add to it. So obviously we do a considerable amount already jointly within the various boundaries that the Commissioner has responsibility and I do. And you know, the stop search scrutiny work that we've done collectively together, the way we've implemented the best use of the stop and search scheme, and the oversight on that has been very much done jointly with the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. And I'm very happy that we continue to do that work jointly, because I think there are some functions of hold to account the Commissioner has that are rightly discharged in that environment. There is also the voice of the public element that I think the Commissioner brings to through his office to policing that is also important in that. So I'm very keen that we look at the data with that level of rigour, that we provide a clearer narrative, and I think we've talked in the paper of things we need to do, and I'll come back to body cams on that in a moment. I think the challenge that we've got, and I think we used this analogy at the start, that we are trying to police an unequal society fairly. And it's the reason why we need to ensure powers are used lawfully, that we want to have an approach on use of force where we minimise it and we continue to learn how we minimise it. But actually, some aspects that drive crime disproportionately impact on some of these communities. And actually, the consequential issue can be that actually policing is more present in those areas. And I think for some people that will be, they feel over-policed. But I also sense sometimes that mood moves. So if we went back to February last year with the deaths of young men, the public desire for a very high level of search was palatable across every community, and particularly in minority communities. So this thing is never a static position, and today we're discussing the disproportionate impact issues around it. I think granularity is very important in this. I think the reason we've taken it down to a local community level is at West Midlands level, data can be misleading, and equally an overly localised level can be as well. But actually, we've got to look in quite a fine-grained way. And I use the overplay between stop, search and use of force here. So on occasions, we will use handcuffs to restrain people while we carry out a search safely. We do need to understand whether or not that handcuffing for search is disproportionate on minorities as opposed to white communities as well. It's one of the areas I know communities raise that creates even more stigma around stop and search. So my sense is we're minimal on the use of these powers. We've got control of them. We do have a level of scrutiny. We do use body cam, but actually there's some fine-grained work needs to lift this. And the body cam issue, particularly on stop search, I think use of force, our coverage is actually better. Bearing in mind a large chunk of use of force is happening in custody where that's covered by cameras and not body cams. I think we're closer to the position we want to be on use of force. I think we do need to do some fine-grained work on body cam use on stop search, unquestionably. So, but the position of working jointly together to provide a well-analysed narrative across this, I think, is important.
Okay, are you happy, Brendan? Do you want to come back?
Perhaps if I come back. I understand the narrative that you end up, particularly in high crime areas, using these powers repetitively at different levels, and that has an impact cumulatively on those communities. What I would say is that my experience of life in general is that once these powers become routinely used in these areas, the threshold of whether it's reasonable or not to use it tends to become very blurred. And therefore, the presumption of officers in those areas may well be that they would use these powers, whereas in other areas they wouldn't, just because that becomes the normal standard of behavior in these particular areas for policing. And that's why I think the body cam data is really important, because where you have 35% discrepancy on search and a 23% discrepancy on force, you're taking out of the review process data that would be significant, particularly if it's all of those instances where the body cam images can't be used in a complaint. So those are the type of things that I think we need to think about when we do this review, because we can look at each element of this individually, but we do need to understand the behavioral consequences of the repetitive and cumulative use of these powers in particular geographical areas.
And I wouldn't disagree with the comments made regarding the body-worn video. In fact, we have the ability now with the development of some of our technology to drill down not only at a sort of force and team level, but down to an individual level. And we would absolutely, and I would absolutely accept, and I chair the governance board around it, that there is work to do regarding the compliance, because actually the use of body-worn video is a really important way for us to examine how our officers are carrying out their powers and how they are engaging with members of the community whilst they carry them out. So it's absolutely something we're going to be having much greater focus on now that we have that data available to us that takes us right down to an individual officer level. So I would agree with that.
Can I just kind of add to that as well, because I think this is important for the public. So, you know, the type of data the force can access now that, you know, we wouldn't have been able to access now in the past is that level of correlation down to what individuals do with their body cam when they turn it on or not. That sounds obvious to people, well, we just have that. But when you look at the amount of occasions it's used, so the investment in the click and the data technology is giving us that information to analyse it more now. The use of force dashboarding that we've done actually throws up quite a lot of issues that we could examine, because I think there are slightly different circumstances where force is being used that reflects different communities. Some of it's, you know, obvious. So, you know, in terms of, you know, alcohol-related violence is lower in South Asian communities for obvious reasons. But actually, use of force is much lower in those areas by police, because we generally would see, you know, less consumption of alcohol. Actually, it's higher in you know, white communities than we'd see in others. So this balance of what circumstances being used. Just with regard to stop and search, I understand the points that are being made. And I think, like all these things, we've got to be careful we don't jump to conclusions around them. Because I'd equally say, if you look at the Section 60 data, you know, where we give without cause ability to search, one, the level the force does is incredibly low compared to most forces that are comparable. But two, the actual level of searching carried out is very low. So when we do a Section 60, we actually do very, very few searches. And I think that does give a kind of indication as to how focused we are and how that isn't just a blank permission to people. The challenge with that, though, is also because the intelligence, they become even more disproportionate on occasions. So this is quite a complex issue, and I think does relate to these broader issues about societies economically and disproportionality in crime, both as victims and on occasions as suspects.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you. If perhaps we could just bring in Tom now. Tom McNeil, can you ask your question, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. According to the report, I think around 70% of the time, maybe more, often more, nothing unlawful or illegal is found on somebody being stopped and searched. Do you think there's a more general question about the use of this power, about how appropriately it's being used, if so often nothing wrong is found on somebody?
Yeah, non-positive outcomes.
Non-positive outcomes is about 70%, yeah. So I think, you know, we have to examine before an officer can carry out a stop search, there has to be, you know, clear grounds for doing that, and they have to be very clear on the object that they are seeking, and that there are other things that they must comply with as well. Bearing in mind that I think what we don't really understand is what does good look like. We find it difficult to compare and get comparators with other forces, but I think we are continually reviewing how we carry out these powers, and actually the grounds of 30% we do find something. You know, it's a question. I have to say I looked at that and thought that that was quite high, but that might just be my personal sort of reflection on it. But I do take the point that in 70% of the occasions we are not finding anything. But bearing in mind we are, you know, we have to have very clear grounds for searching. It is something that we do look at, and is covered very extensively in the training, and is one of the reasons why body-worn video, and accepting the points we've just made around the compliance, is mandated for carrying out stop searches, so that we can continually review and look at how we are carrying out those powers.
I mean, Tom, I suppose in the context I contrast it to other jurisdictions. I think particularly the conversations I've had with colleagues in Holland in particular, who, you know, as a police force have, you know, absolutely minimal power of search. and I think it can create a very difficult environment for policing. I always say this is about how much crime you want to tolerate, and because there's always a balance here, isn't there? We could make policing incredibly intrusive as a society if we chose to significantly minimise crime risk, but we take a view on individual liberty. We're not happy with that. And I never think this is a static debate. I look back to February, we did an extensive level of Section 60 searches because of the level of public apprehension about knife crime. A large portion of that search in itself is a deterrent for people to carry knives. And so it's a really tricky and difficult balance. I do think we need to look carefully at which powers we're using at any one time, though. This is back to the granularity, because there are many different search powers that police have got. So I wouldn't want to be without it as a power. I don't think communities would want to be without it as a power. We search considerably less people than we did years ago, which I think is a very positive thing. But we must be satisfied they're lawful. I would think 30% positive outcome rate is probably high compared to most places, although direct comparison data is not always brilliant. But it's a societal debate, how much searching you want at any one time. Strikes me as my career pendulums year on year, I think.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks, Chief. Gurinder, can I bring you in now, please?
Thank you, Commissioner. I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, paragraph 9 refers to the baseline that was used to assess disproportionality to 2011 census. The paragraph also mentions that while the census has been updated with estimates in, what is your assessment about that being the best use of baseline data, or the best baseline data to be used is that particular set of data? Because I think if there's been, well, anecdotally we would all accept that ethnicity has changed across the region dramatically over the last 10 years, and that could make a big difference to disproportionality figures that were talked about. And secondly, paragraph 47 on the use of force, West Midland Police does not record low-level situations. And do you know of how many other police forces don't record low-level use of force as well? And do you think that will be a large number? Does it have the potential to massively impact on the figures overall? And finally, disproportionality can be looked at in different ways. So you're looking very much in terms of the outcomes. Do you also look at in terms of the people involved, so the individual officers who are carrying out the searches or the use of force? And do you look at disproportionality where there may be a particular team or maybe particular individuals who are more prone to using stop and search, and how do you address that?
So I think to answer the first question, we would absolutely accept that using the 2011 census, it does not give us an accurate representation of the communities of West Midlands Police and the West Midlands area. But at the moment, that is what we have to use. But I think you raised some extremely valid points that if we had more accurate and up-to-date information, then actually, the figures would look very different, because our communities do not look now like they did in 2011.
And just add on the back of that, I think that there is an extrapolation done on the census. I would agree. I think it probably underestimates some groups, and I think it underestimates Black communities from a population perspective. But it's the data we've got. I think you'll see that we probably would say on the pilots we've done around recording stops of vehicles, we're pretty uncomfortable about using residential population as a measure. So, how does that work when we stop cars on the M6? It's actually very hard on vehicle stops to work out a measure that tests fairness. We did a lot of work looking at some work in Connecticut on that, actually, to see what we could do. Nobody's really cracked that, and it's a little bit why, one, because of the volumes, but where we'll use the stops on vehicles, we'll do them against a defined intelligence and operation to try and assess whether we're fair against the objective rather than against the population, because that's much harder to do. You'll also see in use of force, we've also tracked it against our detainee population. So you know, there is a disproportionality in relation to arrests, and we accept that also is an issue. Again, that has broader societal issues as well as criminal justice issues. So we look at our use of force against the arrested population, because again, a lot of people who will be arrested, you know, we don't have many people who don't suffer some form of detention at some point unless they've got away from us or in a crowd, who are not subsequently arrested when we use force, because there's usually a criminal matter there. So we try to use other factors when we can do around that. There was some other maze, we did quite a lot on that.
Which police forces monitor
levels
of stuff?
So I did. So on stop and search, we did a consultation with the community in 2016 on our approach to monitor. So the use of force manual, the basic use of force tactic is something called tactical communications, which is largely please don't do that. It'd be a very good idea not to do it. It's the biggest use of force we have. There are other areas like passive handcuffs. There are also areas like drawing a baton but not using it. Areas where, you know, we would see if we walked out onto Broad Street on Saturday night, numerous examples where officers would draw a baton behind their back as they walk into a large crowd. All those things, I felt at the time that was a burdensome requirement on the force, as was quite a lot of ancillary data that was captured. The two forces that have absolutely refused to take part in those aspects are ourselves and Merseyside Police. We did a discussion with our community around that, and I think the community agreed. We said we ought to focus on the higher ends that concern the public. I've yet to see the public awfully worried about us talking to them to stop them doing things, and hence we kind of took those areas out of the record. The data is required across a lot of these areas in annual data return to the Home Office. I think there's a varying level of analysis done on this between forces. I think we're able to do more now because of the dashboards we built, because that's enabled us to granulate more. If you look at what the fields are that we currently compile, there's a hell of a lot of data in this space. And trying to pull out data in a really effective way, I think, is the reason why Vanessa says we need to do some more analysis. But I wouldn't want to add the lower levels, because if I'm honest, that they're not areas I think are of public concern.
Okay. Corinda, did you want to come back?
My last question was about disproportionality in terms of teams or individuals in terms of their actions.
So we as I've said, you know, earlier, we now have that level of detail against teams and officers, and we are looking very closely at that. Interestingly, a piece of research that was carried out by Warwick University in conjunction with the Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, really showed some interesting data and statistics to us around not showing necessarily disproportionality amongst officers, but then those officers, it did reflect disproportionality against the team, which is a really, you know, you wouldn't absolutely think that there would be that connection. So we're working with that, the authors of that research to really try to understand, but we absolutely have the detail that we can go down, and we do monitor at that kind of level from a team and an individual officer point of view perspective.
Okay, thanks, Corinda, and thanks very much. Can I now bring in Dr. Sarah Marwick? Sarah.
Thank you, Commissioner. My question's around the use of body-worn video. The data obtained from the body-worn video is clearly very, very valuable in understanding what's going on in these areas, but like in many cases, it's what's missing that can be even more valuable. And I'm quite concerned to see the low levels. You know, in stop and search, only 2 out of 3 times is the body-worn video being used. The message seems fairly clear. 100% of the time in these circumstances, you should use body-worn video. It doesn't quite seem to be happening. Do you have any sense or understanding of why that is? And what might be the way of improving the use of this really valuable tool?
So the beauty of the data again is that we can bring this down to individuals and to teams, so really understanding it. And when you do the analysis, which we have done, you will see that some individuals comply in a large proportion of the time. And then what really stands out, though, for me is the team compliance with this, which I think comes back to more around the culture within that individual team. So we see some teams with very high levels of compliance, and I would suggest that's been driven by their supervision and by the questions that are being asked and by the expectations put on that team by the supervision. And there are other teams equally where we see numbers of body-worn videos being downloaded, so we know they're using their body-worn video, but then when you look at the data in relation to the number of times they're using it in stop search, it drops dramatically. So I would suggest that there's a combination of culture within that team, but also compliance and expectations from the supervision. What we can do, though, by having that data, and I have to say that not all forces have this at all. And what we've been trying to do while we've been doing this research is we've been speaking to other forces to try and understand where we are in relation to other forces. They are nowhere near having that level of data and information. So we must use that as we move forward to drive up that compliance, because we see it as being absolutely critical, which is why there are those categories that I read out earlier that are mandated that officers must use their body-worn video. So we're very alive to the differences that we see, and we absolutely need to drive that compliance up now.
And I think it's back to having the availability of that tool now, because the control measure in the past has been supervisors, you make sure it's done. Supervisors, when you check a search, you be making sure it's done and action it. We've not had any bulk way of analysing that per team. Which we do with the click stuff that we've developed now. So we can actually say, why is this team, and some of that was connected to the work around the research that's been done, or why are individuals not picking it up? I mean, it will in practice never be 100%, because there will be on occasions extenuating circumstances. I think when Brendan was asking the question about use of force, so we know that's higher, and we also know a high proportion of use of force is happening in custody, where actually we're not equipped with body cameras. So actually they're actually being filmed on CCTV, not body cams. So there will be occasions. I'm slightly, I'd like it higher on use of force. I'm actually a little less concerned on use of force when you look at the amount in the custody estate, because I think, and also we've talked about Taser automatically activates not just the operator's camera, but the cameras in the proximity to them. So there's a fair amount of stuff on body-worn camera on use of force. Stop search, I am more concerned about. I think that if we have got, I think this enables us to shine a light on some teams and areas to say, you just don't seem to turn your body cam on when you do a search. And I think that is poor practice evidentially, let alone poor practice in terms of community relations and trust. So we definitely need to do more work on that area.
Did you want to come back, Sarah?
I suppose, yes, thank you for that. I suppose the only thing that's just I'm thinking is you can't make an assumption that the circumstances where the video is used are the same as those where the video isn't used. And there may well be extenuating circumstances, but there could be other reasons behind that as well. And so, the fact that this is now being looked at in great detail is very reassuring, and I hope we will start to see much significantly improved figures soon.
Okay. All right. The next question, I think is probably our last question in this section of the agenda, is from Dr. Kath Hannon. Kath, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, Commissioner, thank you. So my question is about scrutiny panels and IAGs. Paragraph 76 encourages people to register with MPUs if they're interested. But where else can they find information about scrutiny panels and independent advisory groups? And what can be done to refresh the concept and representation? And also, should deliberations be anonymised so they can become public information?
So in relation to representation on scrutiny panels, I think that there is information clearly can be obtained directly, but I appreciate what you're asking is where else. So on the website, by contacting the neighbourhood teams, by just generally contacting us, we will provide that information and seek to get more people on board. I think the NPU commanders are continually looking at the representation around their IAGs. In fact, I was over at Wolverhampton yesterday with my quarterly performance review with that team and specifically asked them about what their IAG representation looked like. And I think it's very clear that they have good representation and they actually have some really good young people representation. They were trying to look in other areas to improve that. So it is something that our neighbourhoods are very alive to around what their IAGs look like. I can talk from my experience in Manchester where very often I felt that the IAGs needed a refresh and that people had been on them for a considerable period of time and weren't necessarily representative of the communities. And I think that by the NPU commands and the commanders themselves being asked the question and continually being out there, then they have the opportunity to reach out into the community on a much wider level and ensure that their IAG panels are far more representative, because that's the views that we want to seek.
Do you want to come back, Kath?
Yes, just to ask whether the deliberations from the panels and independent advisory groups are actually shared in a more public arena.
So we certainly share them with the meeting that we hold with the OPCC. I'd have to say, Kath, to be perfectly honest, I'll need to go back and check how we do share those findings wider with the members of the public. I don't see a problem with anonymising the scrutiny that they do more widely. I genuinely can't see an issue with that. And if that's something that we feel would be valuable to the wider community, then I'll absolutely have a look at it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the board members for your questions, and thank you for the Chief and for ACC Vanessa as well for taking those questions. I mean, we've covered quite a lot of bit of ground there, and we've also posed some of the questions that the public wanted answered. Can I just assure members of the public, this isn't the end of the process. It's not the beginning or the end. What we will be doing is in detail at other meetings that we held, not necessarily in public. Further work is being done in each of these areas, and some of it done in quite a lot of detail to examine some of those things that the public quite rightly are asking at this present time. So we will progress this issue. We'll be doing another session probably later on this year where we catch up on some of these issues to make sure that we are responding in a positive and appropriate way to concerns. And could I just complete this part of the agenda with where I began about the announcement of the appointment of new officers. In the next 3 years, we will have approximately 3,000 officers are being appointed. They're mainly younger people by definition, aged between about 18, 19 up to about 30. We are looking very much to appoint a third of those, about 1,000 young people, to come into the police force from our BAME communities. I think that's really very important. We need to do particular work on getting young black men into the force as well. What I want, and I said this 5.5 years ago when I first came to the job, this force has got to look more like the people it represents. We've done some good work. We've made progress. It's been difficult because the numbers we've been recruiting has been very low due to the cuts in our budget. However, progress has been made, and I think there's been quite a culture change in the way we think about recruitment. So that work will be progressed, and in the coming weeks and months, I'll be holding the force to account, A, for making sure that we get the numbers on board, and secondly, that they are proportionate to, or more proportionate to those people who live in our wider communities. And if we're not achieving things, then we've got to be honest and open with the public, and we've got to actually do things about it. And I do say to all people, particularly to parents and teachers and other people who advise young people, do get them to look at taking on policing as a career. There probably has never been a better time to join policing. And this is a wonderful way, of course, to get a degree as well, but actually get it paid for rather than paying loads of fees to universities. So I do urge young people to look very closely at a career in policing as a great way of actually serving your community, but actually bringing about some of the change that we all want to see. So on that note, I will then close this item on the agenda. We now come to item 6 on the agenda, which is split into 3 parts. I hope we can make sort of fairly rapid progress on these items. And these are generally under the heading of the Emergency Police and Crime Plan, which we partly covered last meeting as well. The plan that we adjusted to take into consideration the present concerns that we have with COVID-19. I'm going to ask my deputy, Wahid Salim, if you would chair this part of the meeting and item 7, the financial outturn. So Wahid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. So item 6A is the US Minister's response to efficiency and effectiveness of COVID-19. ACC Jordan, can I just ask, is there any additionality from the paper that you may wish to add? I'm just conscious of time, so I just want to go straight into questions if there isn't.
There isn't, Deputy Commissioner, no. The paper still remains as it was, and I was only going to highlight some key points. So if you'd like to move straight to questions, yeah, that's absolutely in order. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, ACC Jordan. We'll go straight to questions. I'll ask board members if anybody wish to ask any questions. I'll start then, and if board members just indicate which questions they wish to ask. So, ACC Jordan, just on the domestic abuse and the positive outcomes, can you just confirm as to what measures you are taking to try and increase the positive outcomes for domestic abuse? Incidences of domestic abuse are being reported, are increasing quite significantly, although the positive outcome rates has increased from last year to this year, it's still 10.5%. So if you could just give us an overview of what you're doing, what proactive work West Midlands Police is doing around that. I'll move on to my second question, and then I'll come back to other questions later. In terms of the what's been termed as the decompression period, i.e., we're kind of in that period now where things are the lockdown is easing, people are getting back to some sort of normality. There's potential that the pubs and clubs will start to open in July. So what planning is West Midlands Police doing in regard to policing and that period and the impact that may have on resources? I'll let you answer those questions.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Yes. So in terms of domestic abuse, I won't go over, as you've highlighted already, the positive outcome rate. Domestic abuse remains what we call here in the force a force mission. That means for members of the public that it's an absolute priority for us and ensures that our resources are directed and targeted against domestic abuse because it is so important. We see this as a whole force response, not just the responsibility of our public protection unit who hold the focus for where our offences are investigated. So, for example, our neighbourhood policing teams, it's one of their absolute priorities to support this effort with the arrest of domestic abuse offenders, and we track and monitor the number of outstanding offenders that we have. We also have worked very hard to maintain the confidence of our victims in relation to domestic abuse investigations, and work very hard with a number of partners in that aspect as well, who have a key role to play in relation to that. And as such, domestic abuse features in all our local and our force performance meetings, so that we ensure that where we have any gaps that are identified, maybe in terms of resourcing or other areas, that the force is focused upon that, and we can respond accordingly and quickly and effectively, because the absolute priority is around the victims and the safety of those victims around domestic abuse. And we recognise that over the last few months, that safety for victims of domestic abuse and the reporting levels, and whilst we have seen some maintaining and we are now starting to see an increase, we recognise the impact of the lockdown has had on victims of domestic abuse who no longer have had that outlet that they might have had previously. So we're very much alive to that and are working with a number of partners to make sure that the safety for our domestic abuse victims is our priority. Just in relation to your second question, we now are very much in the phase of recovery in relation to COVID, and we have both internal and external recovery groups that sit, and externally is a very important one in relation to what you talked about in the release of lockdown. So firstly, in terms of non-essential stores that opened yesterday, and have been making sure that we have been liaising with all the local authorities around what plans are in place, because we've been very clear, and I'll be honest, that actually the way that the lockdown is released for our retailers is not a policing matter, and that the retailers need to take responsibility in the local authority, leading on that, which they have done, in ensuring that the safety of the members of the public is absolutely paramount. However, we do recognise that when the restrictions are lifted in relation to licensed premises, then that very much will be where we will see an increase in demand for ourselves. And whilst the actual social distancing aspect of the release of that lockdown won't be, we all recognise reductions in crime that have occurred because of our nighttime economy, for example, has not been operating, and that we will need to be working in close liaison not only with local government and national government, but also with those retailers, and we're already doing that in offering them support and guidance as to how they can open safely, and recognise that demand will then generate a demand increase for ourselves, and we're working now in advance of that to make sure that we are able to respond to those increases in demand.
Thank you for those answers. I'm just going to bring in Jonathan Jardine next. If I can just ask that questions and both answers are crisp, that'd be really helpful. Jonathan.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. My question is simply about the international air traveller quarantine requirements. Have there been any issues for West Midlands Police arising from any requirements to enforce the quarantine or be involved in its enforcement?
And the simple answer to that is no, there hasn't. We haven't seen any increase in demand for us in relation to that.
Thank you very much. Tom.
Thank you, Deputy. The report makes reference to intelligence about an increasing level of far-right activity. So I just wanted to know whether you could offer us some insights about the scale of that issue, and then also if you had any insights around what's been done to tackle this form of extremism.
So we're seeing that increase really only in the last couple of weeks in response to the sort of Black Lives Matters issue. We have a number of ways that we seek that intelligence, which ranges from open source information that's available widely to members of the public to other more covert methods that we will use. And we are very alive to it. I think, as the Chief Constable mentioned earlier, our protests and demonstrations here have been overwhelmingly peaceful, and we would seek for that to continue. But we do understand and accept that increase in intelligence in relation to the far right, which we see as a direct response to the Black Lives Matters protests and demonstrations that have taken place. We will continue to monitor the intelligence that we get and continue to ensure that we put an appropriate policing operation in place for any people who wish to peacefully protest and then deal robustly with any potential counter demonstrations that we may see.
Thank you, AC Jardine. Kath.
Yes, thank you. My question is about paragraph 25 and the work the National Crime Agency have been doing. I take it this is a referral to online paedophilia and other matters associated to vulnerable people. 4,000 cases sounds a lot. Do you know ultimately how many will come to West Midlands Police and what the process is for dealing with them?
So we don't yet know what numbers that will look like for us. We do have dedicated teams who are well trained and really understand the processes that need to be gone through in relation to how we investigate and ultimately bring to justice offenders for this. So we will wait to see how many, but I'd just like to reassure the board this is, absolutely one of our most important areas of work, protecting our young people. And whatever numbers we get through, we will ensure we are in a position to deal robustly with those investigations.
I think part of what I'm seeing as a difficulty here, both for this area and domestic abuse and others, is the backlog of cases that are waiting to go into court, and also the response from the courts in how they deal with that. Could you explain how the police are trying to work more efficiently with the court system to bring these cases to some conclusion?
So yeah, we are aware of the significant backlog in court cases and are working very closely with criminal justice partners to look at that. But we are looking at how we can look for alternative ways. So in fact, I was talking to our head of crime just this morning, and we are reviewing many of our cases that would ordinarily people would be charged and go to court. With the absence of a court date, is how we can look at out of court disposals and what alternative methods we can look at in order to ensure that not only do victims receive the justice that they deserve, but also that offenders are dealt with in a timely and appropriate manner, rather than waiting for a court date, which at the moment could look like sometime in the next year.
I'll probably just add briefly to this. So I think it's receiving a huge amount of attention nationally. I know locally, the Deputy Police and Crime Commission is doing a lot of work as part of the LCJB to encourage that work happening. A lot of the levers for this are at national level, and I do think there's been a lot of discussions from my colleague Martin Hewitt, who's the NPCC chair, but also Assistant Commissioner Nick Grave, who leads on criminal justice, with both the Justice Secretary, Lord Chancellor and others. I'm expecting the MOJ to produce a comprehensive recovery plan for the court system, because it is moving slowly, and I think justice delayed, there is a real danger of justice denied. So the flexible approach locally is great, but I actually think there is a pretty substantial piece of national work underway now that I know policing colleagues who lead on that are pushing along.
Thank you.
Can I just come back on that, Wahid?
You very quickly, Catherine.
Yeah, sure. Just to encourage any conversations that are taking place about out-of-court disposals, particularly where they relate to vulnerable people and particularly domestic abuse. Can we include conversation with partners and those who provide support services to victims to ensure we understand the impact of that decision making? Yes,
absolutely, Kath. I'll ensure that happens.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I am actually chairing the recovery board across the whole criminal justice system, and the backlog of cases is one of the biggest issues that are being dealt with across the board, and we will be communicating more around that. I'm going to sum up this part of the debate. I just wanted to ask one question first, because it's just a starking difference in the report was it's paragraph 29, the numbers of the directions to leave. The ACRA figures are 393, which is the national figures, but the app figures in West Midlands is 2811. And it'd be remiss of us not to just get a comment from you about the massive difference between those two figures.
So the directions to leave is just that the ACRO figures are where we have actually given out a fixed penalty notice.
Okay, that's very helpful. That figures is only just for fixed penalty notice and not for deduction for leave. Okay, I just like to sum up on this agenda item before we move on. Domestic abuse cases are continuing to rise, in part down to a large campaign that we have led to encourage victims to come forward. I want to reassure victims that they will be taken seriously, and domestic abuse is a major priority for West Midlands Police. West Midlands Police are closely examining crime trends and likely crime changes as the lockdown eases. I remain of the view that unless the government moves quickly to bring a raft of job retention schemes to guarantee opportunities for young people, we risk a summer of unrest. Right, I'm going to move on to the next agenda item, which is 6B. And again, AC Jardine, is there anything on there that has changed from the report that you've written?
No, Deputy Commissioner, there isn't.
Thank you. I shall move to questions then. Does any board members have any questions they wish to ask? I shall start then, in which case, while people put their hands up, could you just confirm, AC Jardine, about the all the officers or staff that are self-isolating, are they being sent for testing, and is there sufficient testing capacity to ensure that any officer or staff that requires it can get it?
So we absolutely have sufficient capacity regarding testing, and dependent on the circumstances will depend on whether they go for a test. So some of our members of staff are self-isolating because they are in vulnerable categories and are shielding. So I wouldn't expect those necessarily to go for a test unless their circumstances change. But I can reassure you that where officers and staff need to have a test, then we do have the capacity.
Thank you. I don't have any indications from other board members, so I will sum up this paper as well. The Commissioner will be publishing a decision to recognise the huge contribution our volunteer special constables with a one-off payment. This is to thank them for all they've done for the West Midlands during the COVID crisis. And just on the finances, by the end of this month, COVID-related costs, including PPE, will have reached over 8 million. I know the Commissioner is pushing the Home Office to cover our costs in full to ensure that we don't have to cut vital services in the future to deal with the financial cost of this crisis. Okay, I will move on to the next agenda item, which is 6C, and I invite Alethea Fuller, the Deputy Chief Executive, to tell us if there's any specific update that you may wish to tell us in this agenda item.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. So this report is really an exception report in terms of highlighting some additional activity that the OPCC has done over the coming month. So at the last board meeting, we gave an in-depth update on the work that had been done covering Objective 3 and Objective 4. So this report just highlights some of the additional things we've been doing. Things of note are we have submitted our proposal for our commissioned and non-commissioned services for victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence to the Ministry of Justice. We're waiting for a response to that. We were allocated £986,000 between March and October to look at the needs of organisations in response to COVID. So we're waiting to hear back on whether or not they've approved that. We held an online hate crime symposium chaired by Dr. Kath Hannon, where we're trying to coordinate a community response to hate crime and come up with a response of services that's led by the community in terms of hate crime. We also held a virtual community panel on the Thursday, the 11th of June, that was chaired by Craig Pinkney. That was a panel debate featuring the Commissioner and members of the community to look at the current situation, the current tensions, and look at some solutions working with the community. We're in the process of developing an action plan with some of the discussions that came out of that. And finally, I'd just like to raise the Commissioner's Future Generations Deal report that was published on the 28th of May, authored by Tom McNeill, our strategic advisor. which sets out a number of options to respond to youth unemployment. The full report, the link is in the paper that went to board members. So it's just a highlight report really, so I can take any questions on that.
Thank you very much, Alethea, for that. And have Gurinder, who's indicated. Gurinder.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I just wanted to make a comment really regarding paragraph 21, the PCC statement regarding the current tension. And I think the key thing to understand in terms of injustice that is happening, I suppose the biggest injustice that I see that really exists is the almost cyclical nature of what's happening at the moment, and where injustices happen to individuals, sometimes at the hands of the police, sometimes in other circumstances, but the community comes out, they demand action, there's protests, there's reports done, there's all kinds of things, but actually not much really changes, and generation after generation have had to join this fight, and I think the biggest injustice for all of us to be aware of is to be mindful of really is that, you know, we are people who are from different backgrounds in this country. People of if we truly value diversity, then we will value the differences that people bring, and that really is about accepting difference and diversity in a real way. And, you know, so when the whole conversation about statues and monuments happen, it's not just about what those statues mean to individuals, communities who are long established in this country in terms of their, you know, in terms of the Anglo-centric view, or it's not about what they mean to those communities from abroad. It's actually what they mean for the joint future of our children. And that's the approach we need to take. And I think the biggest injustice and the biggest thing that needs to be tackled is this almost cyclical nature of how we find ourselves in this situation again and again and again, but little really changes. So I'm really pleased with the comments made by the Commissioner and also the Chief Constable earlier as well in the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurinder, for those comments. Is there any other questions any board member wish to ask? Yes, Alethea, you wanted to come back.
Sorry, Deputy Commissioner, can I just respond to Gurinder's comments? That was definitely one of the, exactly what you're saying, Gurinder, is exactly the comments that were made by members of the panel about, you know, this goes on and on, we're always having this conversation, you know, the lack of acknowledgement of the situation. The Commissioner read out, you know, parts of that statement, and it was really powerful. You know, and they really, I think that did a lot of good in terms of acknowledging the understanding of where we are and why the community tensions are where, you know, are where we are. So the statement was a really good thing to do. I think the acknowledgement was also really good. I think you're right that people are fed up of talking to us because they tell us we've told you all of this before. So the action plan was focused a lot on the report and, you know, youth unemployment and around young people and what we do about responding to the needs of young people. Many of you, you know, have been out of school since March. Many of you will be unemployed, you know, in the coming months, and some of who are employed or unemployed already. So we've definitely got a lot of those answers already in the Youth Generations Deal report. And it's about how we now work with partners to take on board some of the, you know, some of the proposals that are a really good answer to some of the, you know, the issues that we're dealing with at this moment in time. But yes, I agree with you completely, Gurinder.
Thank you very much. And just to conclude this agenda, on that point, the office and the Commissioner has set out very clear plans. It is now for partners to step up to those and actually make them a reality to ensure that action is taken and that we deal with these underlying issues that our communities are facing, especially our young people coming through this national emergency. So the gauntlet has been put down. It is for others to pick up and run with, and we welcome and we look forward to welcoming the actions that others may take. And just on this agenda item, as I finish, Just to say that although the Commission has received under £1 million from Ministry of Justice, as Diti has just explained, to support domestic abuse and sexual violence support services through the COVID-19 emergency, while any funding is welcome, this is significantly short of the 4.4 million that we actually requested from government to support all the services we provide to victims in the region through this unprecedented crisis. Right, I will move on to the next agenda item, number 7, which is a financial outturn. And I invite Mark Kenyon, our Chief Finance Officer, to give a short presentation on this report.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. This report mainly is a statement of fact of expenditure and income that occurred last year for the force and the PCC overall. You can see from the report there's an underspend of around 8.8 million on the force area, and the board will be aware that that money is needed to help offset future pressures, in particular the pressures that we face in the current financial year, where there's a gap of around £10 million. The report sets out in quite a lot of detail where the underspends have occurred, and I don't wish to go through those now, but it's mainly across all different types of expenditure, particular police officer, staff costs, suppliers and services and premises. The report also includes the yearly expenditure the force incurred in relation to COVID, right at the start of lockdown, which was around £1 million in relation to PPE equipment. The force, as we discussed at the last item, and the PCC have put a claim into the Home Office for refunding all the costs that we've incurred so far, and the likely costs will incur in future in relation to those COVID costs. So hopefully we will receive that funding back from government. In relation to other areas in the report makes reference to the change programme, the WMP 2020 change programme, and you'll see that around £11 million of that has been rephased into the current financial year, and that's to pick up the expenditure on those projects that will finish in the current year, those being around things like our data project and also things around the estates programme as well. The underspend relating to the prevention projects, which are mainly run by the PCC's office, those again have been rephased into the current financial year as well. And finally, the capital programme expenditure is included in the report, where again some money will be spent in the current financial year relating to the estates programme and the change programme as well. So that's all I wanted to say, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that. I just want to make a point and make this very clear that the underspend isn't a real cash. These are all this £8.8 million is allocated money that will be spent in this financial year. So we don't have a cash underspend that we can use for other things. This is all allocated funding that it will be utilised and allocated for expenditure to support the force, but also to ensure that we are investing in the right places to make an efficient, effective force as we move forward through these challenges. So I think it was important just to make that point. Is there any other questions anybody wish to make? No, okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for that, Mark, for the report. And on that note, I shall hand over to the Commissioner with 2 minutes left of the time. I do apologise, Commissioner, I did try and bring it back to time, but over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Wahid, and thank you again for the responses to that, Chief and Assistant. Right, we come on to item 8, the Chief Constable's update. Chief Constable, have you some updates for us, please?
Commissioner, I think we've covered quite a lot of the issues that are of public interest at the moment, really. The only thing I would emphasise that I did mention in my update before was just the results of court on Monday last week around the National Action Trial, and obviously the West Midlands Counter-Terrorism Unit has led the work against National Action, which is a prescribed terrorist organisation that is an extreme right-wing one that has its heart an objective of starting a race war. And I kind of emphasise it really because One, of course, I'm very keen as the chief to identify the stuff we do to offer protection to all our communities, and those individuals in National Action are an absolute threat, particularly to minority communities as well as the fabric of society. But actually, it's been an incredibly long investigation with a number of court trials which that the force has led. So I'm particularly proud of the work that's been done by the team around that at the moment. That's probably the main thing I would cover off, and we've covered quite a lot today.
Indeed. Are there any quick questions anybody has for the Chief Constable? No? Okay, if that's the case, then can I say, Chief, we today has been a good meeting, and I think we've covered, as you say, a lot of ground. But just for members of the public, this isn't the only area which we cover these things. We cover them in far more detail in other forums that we have as well. And I think that's absolutely right. The police at the moment, as most other public organisations, are facing a lot of challenges and a lot of differences, and a lot of changes have taken place. And I think, Chief Constable, I would like to congratulate you and all your officers and the staff that work with the force for the work that you're doing in these really quite challenging times, and for being so flexible and keeping up to date on issues as you have done. So thank you very much for that, and for the questions you've answered today. Right, so just the last one, the date of the last meeting. Can someone advise the date of the next meeting, please?
Commissioner, it's the 21st of July. Apologies.
The next meeting is the 21st of July, and we'll be looking forward to questions from the public as well, and any suggestions that we get, we will take on board. But can I firstly thank the Chief and Vanessa, whose assistant will become Deputy Police Chief Constable at the end of the month, and we do look forward to that. Can I also say that today we're saying farewell to the current Deputy, Louisa Rolfe, who has served an excellent term the last 3 or 4 years she's been with us. She has been truly, truly excellent. And we do wish her well in her new post with the Met. And I'm sure she'll keep us informed on, and we'll hear more from her in the future. So thank you for that. So with that, can I thank as well the board members for your questions, for your time, and also for those who work in support of the meeting from the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner, of whom there are quite a few. Thank you for your work. So with that, I will declare the meeting at precisely, I think, 12 noon